of today's webinar is Neglected Tropical Diseases and One Health, Gearing Up Against Antimicrobial Resistance to Secure the Safety of Future Generations. This discussion takes place as the world observes the week-long antibiotic awareness event from the 18th until today, 24th of November. It doesn't mean that we will stop here. We will keep our push to create awareness around antimicrobial resistance. My name is Ashok Mulu, and I'm the Information Officer with the Department of Control of Neglected Tropical Diseases at WHO, headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. We all know antibiotics are arsenals we have to save lives and are critical in many ways to treat a number of common and more serious infections. And that anytime antibiotics are used, they have the potential to cause side effects and contribute to some kind of resistance, which today is a potential threat to public health. During this week, we are all contributing to discussions that can help in creating awareness about antimicrobial resistance and how and when we should take antibiotics, how to keep us healthy, and how to help fight resistance to ensure that these will be available for future generations. In the field of neglected tropical diseases also, the potential emergence of drug resistance is real. Due to a large dependence on preventive and curative chemotherapy, resistance to currently used drugs may jeopardize our entire interventions and can put at risk the global programs we have and that cater for many millions of marginalized populations. So during the next 2 hours, we'll be looking at the broader AMR issues and levels of resistance that have been reported for some of the medicines that are used in the treatment of NTDs. And these include diseases like sleeping sickness, Kala Azar, leprosy, and yaws, among others. So before we get on to the serious matters for today, let me turn to some housekeeping issues. First, today's discussion has simultaneous interpreting services in English, French, and Spanish. To access this interpretation service, if you look at the screen, you look for the pop-up bar at the bottom of the screen. From here, you can select the language of your preference. I would take this opportunity to bring to the attention of panelists that you will need to close your interpretation option when not needed, as this option can cause audio interference during the discussion. To submit questions, you can use Slido by entering the event code, which is, the hashtag is already populated, so NTDs AMR. Again, NTDs AMR. You may be asked a few questions, after which there will be a prompt to join the session using the Q&A option on the page to field your questions. And if you're using social media, especially Twitter, please use hashtag #BeatNTDs and hashtag antimicrobial resistance, one word, or hashtag WAAW2020 to disseminate messages and to link up to messages bearing all these hashtags so that we can link up in a sequence with the messages. Lastly, please mute all your mobile phones as much as possible to avoid any background disruption. So before I proceed to introduce you to today's panel, let me inform you that besides broadcasting live on Zoom, we'll be streaming on YouTube, and a link will be made available for viewing anytime after this live webinar. We will try to address as many questions you will be asking during the discussions, but in case we are not able to do so due to time constraints, we'll make sure that answers to those that we are not able to respond will be sent to you after the webinar. So today's discussion, colleagues, will be moderated by Professor Santiago Mascoma, and you can see his short bio that will come up very shortly, and those of other panelists on the screen. So among the panelists for today, we have Professor Emmanuel Cambeau, Professor Bruno Levesque, Professor Sham Sundar, Dr. Oriol Mitta, and Dr. Catherine Oldenburg. They are all experts in their areas of work, and we are pleased to welcome them to this important forum. As for now, I'm pleased to hand over to Professor Mascoma, who will chair the discussion. Professor Mascoma, the microphone is all yours.
Tenía aquí puesto el sonido ahí. Ya lo he sacado. Me parece que no lo ha hecho bien.
Professor Mascoma, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. You hear me? Good afternoon to everybody. We have restricted time, unfortunately, so let's go directly to the subject. Please, Dr. Daniel, can you give us your overview, please?
We start with the opening remark from Dr. Haile Jesus Getaun, who is the Director of the Global Coordination and Partnership for Antimicrobial Resistance.
Proceed.
Dr. Haile Jesus.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I get the slides? Just I would like to show you. Thank you very much also for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And it is my great pleasure to be on this panel and on this webinar to discuss antimicrobial resistance in the context of neglected tropical diseases. As you can see, can you see the slide?
Not yet.
Can you?
No.
And now?
Yeah, you can put it in slideshow mode.
Yeah.
Yes.
So antimicrobial resistance is a complex issue. As you can see from this simple diagram, that it deals with humans, animals, the food, and the feed plants, as well as the environment. And the corner, the critical issue is that we all share antimicrobials with all these beings. And the challenge is also ranging from misuse and overuse, be it in human beings, be it in animals and plants, which in a way was also related to food security and global health security, as well as trade. So that is why WHO is taken a step in the last 2 years in order to enhance the global response for antimicrobial resistance by having a division that is dedicated to respond to the multi-sectoral as well as to the health sector specific response. And in next slide, as part of our move into the different areas of strengthening the health sector response, one thing which we've done in the last 5 years was commemorating World Antibiotic Awareness Week. This year, we have changed that into World Antimicrobial Awareness Week so that it can also cover antivirals, antiparasitics, which are of relevant to you all, antifungal and antiviral, in addition to antibiotics. The reason why we want to move into this is that because issue of drug resistance and the complexity is not only related to antibiotics. So we are happy that the NTD community takes this first step because we also share antibiotics in your treatments. We also share antiparasitics, which are also shared with animals and possibly also with plants, that we need to address them in a collective way. So as part of our move, what we have done for this year's World Antimicrobial Awareness Week is to fix the dates. In the past, it used to be in any of the week from Monday to Friday that has the 18th of November as a starting date. And we also make sure that we have expanded the scope to cover all antimicrobials. In a way, it will also help us to facilitate synergy and efficiency between the different public health programs so that we can handle antimicrobials and save the future of our generation. And once again, thank you very much. And we look forward to work with you in a broader context in preserving our treatments for neglected tropical diseases, our antibiotics and our antiparasitics. And I wish you all the best in the deliberation of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gitahan, for this welcome. I think we should already go directly to Dr. Dania for his overview.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Maskoma. I will go to my presentation. So my presentation will be an overview of antimicrobial use and antimicrobial resistance threat or concern for commonly used NTD medicines. As you all know, and as Haile Jesus also pointed out, neglected tropical diseases include over 20 plus categories of diseases, which are caused by helminthic parasites, viruses, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, ectoparasites, and including even non-communicable diseases like a snake bite. These diseases causes tremendous morbidity and tremendous, also they cause significant mortality, especially the kinetoplastids and some of the bacterial diseases. But they importantly cause major disability, disfigurement, or even stigmatization and discrimination. The major strategic interventions that we use for NTDs are preventive chemotherapy. With this approach, over 1 billion people were treated annually since 2016. And in the intensive case management or in the individual disease management, more than 1 million life-saving treatments have been delivered only in 2019. So this shows that how much the NTD community is using several antimicrobials, antiparasites, antibiotics, and other antifungal medicines for the prevention, cure, and also for elimination and overall control of neglected tropical diseases. So this approach, this approach and this intervention is supported or complemented by integrated vector management, WASH, and the veterinary public health strategies, or the One Health approach. Significant number of neglected tropical diseases are also of zoonotic origin, and the One Health approach is very, very relevant. It is also at the same time very relevant for the prevention of antimicrobial resistance development, as we will be discussing later on. So coming to the commonly used medicines for NTD treatment, this overview is by no means intended to give a detailed information as to the resistance status or the surveillance of antimicrobial resistance for NTD medicines, but rather to show you the number and type of medicines that are currently and commonly being used by NTDs, and at the same time, the status of AMR and the threats and the concerns for each of these diseases. So, broadly, the commonly used medicines include rifampicin, clarithromycin, and streptomycin. Resistance has been reported to rifampicin and streptomycin to emulsiran isolates in the past. Development of cross-resistance is a concern, as rifampicin is widely used in tuberculosis control, in leprosy, and other infectious diseases as well. For Chagas disease, the two commonly used medicines are nifurtimox and benzimidazole. These medicines have been used for a long time. So far, no resistance has been reported. However, there is geographic variation in therapeutic response due to various factors, including the T-Cruzi discrete typing unit, the inoculum, the infection, etc. But so far, we don't have any evidence for antimicrobial resistance. For echinococcosis, the benzimidazoles are the commonly used, sometimes in combination with praziquantel. Medical treatment is only one part of the whole series of combination of clinical management. There is low evidence for resistance, and there are no gold standard methods to determine biological status and response to treatment. Foodborne trematodes, triclabendazole is commonly used. We'll come back later. Professor Santiago will be covering this in detail, but resistance has been reported in areas where resistance to veterinary infection also occur simultaneously. Human African trypanosomiasis in the past, melarsoprol resistance to TB gambiense has been reported. Recently, a combination of nifurtimox eflornithine is being used, and we have this new oral medicine for the first time, fexinidazole, and recently no drug resistance has been reported. Leishmaniasis, we have a list of medicine, about 5-6 medicines, and this is one of the kinetoplastids where we have resistance have been reported to the first line treatment, sodium stibogluconate. This has been reported in Southeast Asia, and a reduced treatment response also for miltefosine. The use of miltefosine in Latin America countries and Europe for treatment of canine leishmaniasis or dog leishmaniasis is a threat. And use of single-dose ambisome is also another concern for development of resistance. We'll have also a session on drug resistance in leishmaniasis later on by Professor Shyam Sundar. Leprosy, rifampicin, dapsone, clofazimine are used as MDT, and also resistance has been reported to most of the anti-leprosy medicines. Even if it is from small samples. We will have also a session from Professor Cambo on leprosy AMR situation. For lymphatic filariasis, the 3 drugs, the use of albendazole, diethylcarbamazine, and ivermectin. Use of single drugs, suboptimal responses basically develop after many years of mass drug administration, especially for the single or for the double. However, now treatment have moved to use of triple drug therapy using ivermectin, diethylcarbamazine, and albendazole. and this is believed to reduce development of resistance. On the fungal diseases, mycetoma, chromoblastomycosis, and deep mycosis, for the EU mycetoma, itraconazole and ketoconazole are the commonly used medicines, whereas for actinomycetoma, antibiotics like trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, or the so-called Bactrim, amikacin are the commonly used. Once there is good treatment response for the actinomycetoma. However, the response for antifungals, be it for mycetoma or chromo, is low, and the treatment duration is very, very long, ranging from 6 months up to 18 months. So there is a high or increased risk for resistance, and treatment in both cases for fungal, the fungal mycetoma and the chromo is low. The treatment response is low, and there is common treatment refractory, and at the same time there is no resistance monitoring, systematic resistance monitoring. For onchocerciasis, ivermectin is used. Suboptimal response have been reported, and treatment failures have also been reported. For the other helminth, schistosomiasis and CTH, no resistance in human infection reported. However, reported low efficacy for hookworm, and for animal infection has also been reported for these diseases. Scabies and other ectoparasites, even if there are some sporadic reports about resistance, but most of these reports indicate rather low treatment efficacy due to various reasons associated with poor management, clinical management, application error, patient compliance, etc., rather than resistance. However, there is no also systematic resistance be it for perimetrin cream or for ivermectin. Trachoma, we will have a session later on azithromycin. There is no evidence for azithromycin resistance following mass treatment, but the issues concern us and what we need to do will be discussed later on by Professor Katrin Oldenburg. For teniasis and cysticercosis, niclosamide and praziquantel are commonly used, and there is no documented resistance. However, we have to note that there is no also systematic resistance surveillance. We use azithromycin currently. In the past, benzathine penicillin also has been used widely, and it has demonstrated good efficacy with interruption of transmission in India. However, emergence of azithromycin in use have been reported recently by Oriol, and the researcher who have reported that is with us today and will be discussing in detail about the threat of azithromycin resistance for the US eradication program. So in conclusion, what are the key issues for NTDs in the AMR movement? We have in the NTDs, we have so many diseases with few alternative therapeutic arsenals for most or all of NTDs. Most of the NTD medicines have been developed for and used for decades, for many decades. There is no systematic monitoring or surveillance for antimicrobial resistance for most NTDs, except some attempts on drug efficacy for monitoring of helminth drug efficacy, and as well as some resistance monitoring in leprosy. So there is a need to establish close monitoring of treatment efficacy as well as resistance monitoring mechanism, including the development of guidance documents. For helminths and zoonotic infections, improving use of animal vaccines will reduce the anti-parasite treatment needs, thereby reducing the drug pressure. And at the same time, we need to promote the use of different medicines to treat zoonotic infections versus human infections. Validated biomarkers are lacking for effective monitoring of AMR for most NTDs. And NTDs should advocate to benefit from current movement and attention for monitoring and prevention of antimicrobial resistance and related initiatives. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Over to you, Professor Mascoma.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this nice overview and to show us the complexity that we are facing. Indeed, the meeting today is highly motivating in the sense that we will have the occasion to see completely different models of diseases, from directly transmitted diseases up to very complicated vector-borne zoonotic diseases. So this is a very nice opportunity to further analyze the problem. So thank you very much. Let's go to the next one, which is on leprosy. Professor Emmanuel Cambeau, please, your turn.
Well, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank WHO for the invitation to speak about antimicrobial resistance monitoring in the leprosy treatment. So I'm a medical doctor at the University of Paris. Antimicrobial resistance in leprosy, start as soon as we found a good antibiotic, which was dapsone, given as monotherapy in 1950. And then dapsone resistance was observed some years after. And when we start using rifampicin, it was the same. And even when we start using ofloxacin, which was not developed as an anti-leprosy drug, we observed also resistance. And that's the reason why the WHO standard MDT designed in 1982 is a combination of dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine, first to avoid resistance. And the leprosy treatment is still these drugs, but rifampicin and clofazimine is given monthly supervisedly, and dapsone and clofazimine in addition are taken daily. And recently it was modified to give 12 months to MB leprosy, that's mean cases with more than 5 skin lesions, and 6 months to PB leprosy, mean possibacillary cases with less than equal to 5 skin lesions. And the impact of resistance is that if you have a rifampicin resistant strain, then you have to take a 2-year regimen for 3 drugs daily during 6 months, then 18 months daily of 2 drugs. And of course, the free of charge blisters do not exist for this treatment. And that's the reason why we should keep the M. leprae strains susceptible not only to rifampicin, but also to ofloxacin, minocycline, and clarithromycin. And it's very difficult to assess for resistance or susceptibility because Mycobacterium leprae is a bacteria that does not grow in vitro. And so the only phenotypic test is to inoculate M. leprae in the mouse foot pad. And the mice are treated by antibiotics during 1 year because M. leprae doubling time is far longer than the other bacteria, about more than 10 days, when it's 1 day for MTB and 20 minutes for E. coli. So you can see that it's a very fastidious phenotypic susceptibility testing where you need skilled technicians. So today, very rare labs are still performing this. And that's the reason why as soon as we could move to molecular detection of resistance, thanks to Stuart Cole, who described the M. leprae genome and the first mutations that determine and confer rifampicin resistance. If you know about MTB, rifampicin resistance is the same. The resistance are observed, the mutation are observed in the LPOB gene in a small region of it called region determining rifampicin resistance. And as soon as you got a mutation, then you can know that the strain is resistant. And that's what was described in this genotypic assessment of M. leprae resistant. It's a guide we published with WHO, a first one in 2001. And this was recently updated. And we propose to all countries 3 methods to detect resistance. The first is the PCR sequencing, classical one. The second is commercially available line probe assay. And the third one is the whole genome sequencing, which is a little bit more difficult to do, or you need an expert laboratory. And the mutations, they are in the guide, telling you if you got this one, it's rifampicin resistance, or this one is dapsone resistance, or this one is quinolone resistance. And thanks to that, we published the first prospective survey on AMR in leprosy, thanks to this WHO surveillance network. And you can see that among 2,000 cases which were studied, among 200,000 cases per year, we observed 8% of resistance with at least resistance to rifampicin, dapsone, or fluoxetine. And you can see on this map that the big 2 countries with leprosy, which are India and Brazil, they have more than 10 rifampicin resistant cases as a sentinel survey. And Indonesia is between 3 and 10, and even African countries, which are low-level resistance countries, they have more than rifampicin resistant case. And you will not be surprised to see that the resistant case was observed in relapse case, but also in new cases. But resistant cases were more often detected in retreatment case for rifampicin and dapsone because they are part of the leprosy treatment. But for fluoxetine, which is an antibiotic given for urinary tract infection or other skin infection, then it's more seen in new case, or in new case as in retreated case. And the objectives of AMR surveillance in leprosy are to determine M. leprae resistance to rifampicin first, but also to the other drugs. And among retreatment cases, of course, all of them, but also in new cases. And we assess 10% of them, but that may differ from districts and countries, to monitor resistance rates over time, and also provide information on the patients. Who are these cases with resistance strain? And that's how it goes in the Sentinel surveillance network. We come from the clinic, then goes to the laboratory with the skin samples, where we do PCR sequencing or other methods. And then the result go back to the clinics. If there are no mutation, the patient, of course, had received standard MDT, but if there is a mutation, treatment adequation is done, and also this is report to WHO. So in a conclusion, antimicrobial resistance does exist for rifampicin, dapsone, and fluoxetine in leprosy. The surveillance is organized by WHO, but supported by different NGOs, and it's part now of the new strategy. It should remind that the current MDT might not be efficient forever. So we need research on new anti-leprosy drugs. And we've seen that resistance can be due to previous treatment, but also from the general use of antimicrobials. So we need a medical commitment in and outside leprosy field to not overuse antimicrobial agents. And that's the reason why I think the conference we have today is very, very important. Thank you for your attention.
Mute on.
Santiago, you was muted.
No questions?
So I don't know if you have questions.
I have one, Emmanuel. There is no possibility of the appearance of cross resistance between the different drugs you are using?
Well, so far we don't have, fortunately. What we observed is co-resistance or association of resistance. For instance, a patient was treated with dapsone monotherapy, then he developed dapsone resistance, and then he was receiving rifampicin as monotherapy, and then, you know, the strain became resistant to dapsone and resistant to rifampicin, so resulting in multi-drug resistant strain. This was observed in patients who relapsed several times from monotherapy. But fortunately, so far, we don't have cross resistance between the drugs, but unless we don't know that, because you've seen it's not that easy to know.
Yeah, with your permission, we have a question for Professor Cambo.
Yeah.
And the question is, Professor, what is best practice advice to countries to prevent antimicrobial resistance in leprosy treatment?
Well, you've seen the leprosy treatment itself is given as a multi-drug therapy, so it's not a problem to give it. There are two problems. First is to give these drugs outside leprosy field, and of course rifampicin and ofloxacin, they are given from other purposes, and so I would advise to have supervised treatment. That was control selling of drugs, you know, these kind of drugs, so I would say not overuse them when you don't need them. And that's the best advice. Of course, there is also a concern about preventive treatment, which is now advocate for leprosy as a post-exposure prevention by using rifampicin single dose monotherapy. And I think we need to be cautious because, you know, when you give this in a well-controlled study, it's okay. But if it starts to be given widely, then of course that might be more difficult to know if these leprosy cases is post-exposure or is under clinical a case with few signs, because it's not that easy to diagnose it. So I think there will be much discussion about this. It's not a massive drug administration, but it's single dose rifampicin used for post-exposure prophylaxis. And of course, we need to monitor resistance more than ever, I would say.
So there is another question here at another level. The question reads like this: how can quality be assured by in-country laboratories that perform testing for AMR in leprosy?
It's not very difficult, you know. If the lab is used to detect resistance in M. tuberculosis, for instance, in tuberculosis, in each country you have a lab specialized in this. If he knows about to do for MTB, he will know what to do for leprosy. So that's one good point. And also we start to organize some quality control. So external quality control can be done quite also easily. So I think that will not be a problem. The problem is to find a laboratory which can do that, not too far from patients and not too far from reference centers. Are there other questions?
No, thank you, Professor Cambo.
Well, thank you very much.
There's no more time, but there is the last possibility to enter in comments and in the last discussion. So we rush to the next one, and we are to the diseases of yaws and trachoma. So please, Dr. Mija and Dr. Oldenburg.
Hi, I think I'll start with the presentation on azithromycin resistance in yaws. So I would like to share my screen now. Good. So yeah, I will. I'm Dr. Oriol Mitja. I'm Associate Professor on Infectious Disease in Barcelona, and I will present on yaws, which is a disease caused by bacterial infection. The causative organism is Treponema subspecies pertenue, and this bacteria can lead to deformity and ulcers in the skin of affected children. So in 2012. We showed that a single dose of azithromycin given orally can cure the disease. So currently, azithromycin is being used to implement an ambitious WHO strategy to eradicate the disease, and mass drug administration with azithromycin is implemented in countries in Africa and Oceania, the Pacific Islands. What happened is that we had experience in Papua New Guinea of detection of macrolide resistance. The detection is similar to that in syphilis. What happens is that mutation occurs in the binding site of the ribosome, and the single mutation in the RNA of ribosomal RNA can spoil the azithromycin effect. There are two mechanisms or two techniques how we can detect the mutation. One is through direct sequencing and identify that mutation. Two major mutations are the A2058G or A2059G. Then there is the most commonly used technique, which is an RFLP analysis, where what we use is restriction enzymes so that the DNA sample is digested into fragments. And here what you can see in the photograph is a wild type compared to a strain where the restriction pattern is different, showing that the mutation occurred in these two strains. So in our experience, we launched a mass drug administration program in Lihir Island. We treated 20,000 people, and we observed, as you can see in the graph on the right side, that at baseline there was a prevalence of 1.8 active yaws cases among that population. That's approximately about 400 yaws cases. What happened is on month 0, we administered azithromycin with a high coverage in that population. We could not find resistance or treatment failures initially, but there were some remaining cases that had to be treated on subsequent years. So over the following months, 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30, we administered azithromycin only to the actively identified yaws cases. And on the graph underneath, what you can see is the resistance appearance. In purple, it's the wild type sequence, while in orange, you have the A2059 mutation. So on month 36, that's 3 years after the initial MDA, we identified 2 cases with macrolide resistance. And that spread to 3 other cases at 42 months. So that's a total of 5 confirmed cases. And the same experience occurred recently in a mass drug administration in another region, also of Papua New Guinea, where after 3 TCTs or MDA resistance occurred. And this is the case. It wasn't. This is the index case, male, 11 years of age, with a primary yaws ulcer, where we identified a wild type microbe. And we administered 1.5 grams of azithromycin according to weight. And that kid, 6 months later, was still infected on the serology, but also he developed papillomatous lesions at multiple sites of the body, showing that the bacteria had not been eliminated. And we could identify that the strain was still the same, but it had developed a mutation that had to be treated with penicillin. So when we did the whole genome sequencing, we could identify that all those 5 cases on the phylogenetic tree were located in the same region. This means that it was a single strain that had spread to all the three kids. And on the right side, what you see is the deep sequencing of the first index case on October 2015. It was a sensitive or susceptible case, but the index patient had developed a resistance, and he had infected or transmitted that mutation to siblings, playmates, and school friends. And that's what we could identify in our analysis. So in conclusion, what we see is that resistance can occur, not very commonly, but it can eventually occur at least once on a mass drug administration program. And most importantly is that it can spread to others. So such resistance could compromise your MDA. Therefore, what we recommend is the careful monitoring of clinical and biological surveillance of YOS MDA programs. Clinical means to conduct a second visit after 14 days of treatment and identify if there's any treatment failure. And biological means to continue with detection systems where some of those specimens can be sent to a reference lab for drug-resistant testing. And the second recommendation is to propose alternative regimens for cases detected with macrolide resistance post-MDA. So we have recently been doing research using a new in vitro culturing system. And for the first time ever, we could test the drug susceptibility in treponeme species. We found that linezolid was efficacious in vitro, and therefore we did corroborate in the experimental model in rabbits that linezolid, as you can see in the picture A, induced healing of lesions at a similar time as benzocaine penicillin G, while untreated animals were not cured, and we also tested moxifloxacin or clofazimine that were not useful. So linezolid, which has a cost range of about €2 and it's overall safe, could potentially be an alternative when azithromycin failed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We will have the questions on these presentations at the end. So please, Dr. Aldenburg.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me. My name is Katie Oldenburg, and I am an assistant professor and an infectious disease epidemiologist at the at the University of California in San Francisco. And to follow on Oriel's presentation, I'm going to be talking about antimicrobial resistance after mass azithromycin distribution for trachoma. I'll also touch very briefly on azithromycin distribution for child mortality. Mass azithromycin distribution, which involves distribution of azithromycin to an entire population, is used in several different conditions, including YAS, like Oriel was just talking about, as well as in trachoma, and more recently in child mortality. In trachoma control programs, the entire population is treated all at the same time on an annual basis. So azithromycin distributions occur every year. And the dose is a 20 milligram per kilogram dose up to a 1 gram maximum adult dose. And so for these, in some communities have been treated for over a decade. And despite repeated treatment, there are communities that continue to have significant trachoma prevalence. And so one question has been, is there emergent azithromycin resistance or macrolide resistance in Chlamydia trachomatis, which is the causative organism of trachoma? So to date, as in some other organisms, detection of resistance in Chlamydia trachomatis is relatively difficult, requires either culture and sensitivity or more recently genetic approaches. There have been a handful of studies that have evaluated macrolide resistance in chlamydia specifically and have not found evidence of macrolide resistance following mass azithromycin distribution for trachoma. And more recently, in some communities in Amhara, which have received multiple years of azithromycin mass drug administration, there's been no evidence of macrolide resistance alleles in a genetic study. And so in totality, we have not seen evidence of chlamydia resistance following mass azithromycin distribution for trachoma. However, azithromycin is a broad spectrum antibiotic, and there's the potential for bystander effects where there may be resistance selection in organisms that are not the target organism. These are some results from a systematic review that was led by Dr. Kieran O'Brien, who's an epidemiologist at the Proctor Foundation. And she looked at the totality of the evidence published in 2018 to all organisms that have been reported in the literature. And one that is really commonly evaluated is Streptococcus pneumoniae. And so evaluation of resistance after mass azithromycin and pneumococcus has been done in multiple studies. In general, what we see at the population level is a short-term increase in the prevalence of resistance in pneumococcus following mass azithromycin distribution, followed by a decline in the prevalence of resistance after azithromycin distribution is discontinued and selection pressure is removed. And sort of along these lines, we also saw in the systematic review that in general, the frequency of azithromycin distribution affected the prevalence of pneumococcal resistance in communities. And so this figure is showing communities that received one single round of azithromycin distribution, communities that received repeated annual azithromycin distributions, and communities that received biannual, twice yearly azithromycin distributions, and generally seeing a trend where the prevalence of azithromycin distribution increases as the frequency, the prevalence of resistance increases as the frequency of distribution increases. The systematic review also identified evidence of resistance in other organisms, and to summarize those briefly, so in E. coli, there were 3 studies that in general found evidence of increased resistance selection and some evidence similar in pneumococcus to decrease after antibiotic selection pressure was removed. In Staphylococcus aureus, again, we saw an evidence of increased resistance. And then in Mycoplasma genitalium, no evidence of resistance in a recent study. This was not included in the systematic review as it just came out recently. And in Plasmodium falciparum, again, no evidence of resistance. So more recently, azithromycin has been considered for use for prevention of child mortality in high mortality settings. And this is slightly different from the mass drug administration used for trachoma, where this is focused on children aged 1 to 59 months of age. And is distributed biannually. So the MORDOR study was a study in 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Tanzania, Malawi, and Niger, that showed that mass azithromycin distribution to children aged 1 to 59 months significantly reduced all-cause mortality in these children. In the Niger study site, in a study led by Tui Dewan and Ahmed Arzika, 30 communities that had participated in MORDOR received 48 months of either biannual mass azithromycin distribution or placebo, and rectal samples were collected in children in these communities to evaluate for genetic resistance determinants following azithromycin distribution. This used a DNA-seq for whole genome sequencing to evaluate the resistome, so that we were able to look at genetic resistance determinants to that were present in the stool. And similar to what's been shown following azithromycin for trachoma was that there was evidence of significant resistance to macrolides. And so these results were published just on November 12th in the New England Journal by Dewan and colleagues. And so this figure is showing a number of different classes of antibiotics and the effect of in azithromycin compared to placebo communities. And so the results that are to the right of that dotted line indicate an increased factor difference showing increased resistance to azithromycin compared to placebo communities. And so these results indicate a 7-fold increase in macrolide resistance in children receiving azithromycin compared to placebo. And just highlighting one other, this is beta-lactams. So this is some indication that children in azithromycin communities have increased prevalence, increased resistance to beta-lactams compared to those in placebo communities. I will note that the confidence intervals are relatively wide, but this was something that came out of this analysis was that there seemed to be some evidence that there could be resistance to other antibiotic classes in children in the azithromycin communities. So a lingering question is really what the clinical impact of resistance is after azithromycin distribution. Macrolides are not the most commonly used antibiotic class in communities that are indicated for mass azithromycin distribution, both for trachoma and for child mortality. These are some data showing the antibiotic classes that are commonly used in communities, and you can see that amoxicillin is by far the most common antibiotic class, and that erythromycin use is comparatively much less common. Azithromycin is an important first-line treatment for many common infections such as Campylobacter. So understanding if there's any, what the implications are clinically for resistance is important. Ongoing analysis of the MORTAR trial has not indicated any decrease in efficacy over time for childhood mortality, which could be taken as indication that if there were to be an increase in resistance that was affecting clinical outcomes in children, that perhaps azithromycin would become less effective over time if the mechanism of azithromycin effect on mortality is through prevention of some of these infections. So priorities for monitoring AMR after azithromycin distribution include continued monitoring of chlamydia trachomatis resistance, including monitoring with new genetic techniques. Understanding the impact of targeting distribution, for example, only to children compared to treating an entire community for antimicrobial resistance, whether treating an entire community affects children, affects antimicrobial resistance in a different way than targeting a subset of the community. And then continued monitoring for a decreased efficacy of antibiotics following mass azithromycin distribution, both in chlamydia, specifically for trachoma, as well as for other common infections. Thank you for your attention.
Maybe
Professor must comment.
Well, thank you very much for your nice updates of these the problematics that we have on drug resistance on these two diseases. So do we have questions for both?
Chair, if you allow, I have a couple of questions for Dr. Mehta for his earlier presentation. Do you want me to field, to ask those questions first and then to Katie?
Yes.
Okay, so for Oriol, the question reads, you documented resistance to azithromycin a few years ago. Given the critical role of this antibiotic in the eradication of yaws, what should be done to ensure that resistance does not become widespread to derail the eradication efforts?
Thank you for the question, which is really relevant. Currently, WHO is implementing administration with azithromycin to treat and eradicate yaws in multiple communities in remote areas. So those programs probably need to consider how they are going to monitor treatment failure. Whenever a case of treatment failure is identified, ideally that person should be treated with an alternative regimen. and at the same time, if at all feasible, PCR, well, a swab collection for PCR testing and macrolide resistance detection could be done, so that in the event that macrolide resistance is identified, the whole community should receive alternative treatment with penicillin.
Another question?
I have one follow-up question for Dr. Mehta. Are there any new drug development studies being done to ensure that we have alternatives to azithromycin?
Yes, that's very important. The data is not yet published. The most commonly used antibiotic for yaws and syphilis was penicillin. Then we developed azithromycin as an alternative regimen that is easier to administer in remote regions. Azithromycin is working very well, and at the same time, we need to be conscious and get ready for developing further options. So we are working with University of Washington and Dr. Giacani on the discovery of new molecules. So far, we have found that linezolid is a good alternative.
Thank you. Questions about trachoma? We have one.
Yes, Chair. Now we'll direct that to Katie. There is one question. A recent publication suggested that mass treatment with azithromycin may have a role in decreasing child mortality in Africa. How do you think use of that intervention might affect AMR compared to the impact you described in trachoma programs?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting one. So I think that one notable difference between mass azithromycin distribution for child mortality compared to trachoma is that mass azithromycin distribution for childhood mortality is focused only on a very small subset of the population. So it's only to children under age 5. Versus for trachoma, it's to every individual over 6 months of age in a given community. And so I think that there is potential for sort of reduced selection for resistance when you're only targeting a very small subset of the population. That said, there have not been head-to-head comparisons or head-to-head studies where we've compared communities in the same geographic area that have been, been randomized, for example, to get a full annual MDA to the entire community compared just to children. So we don't know for sure that that's the case. And we certainly have seen, like some of the data I presented, we have seen that distribution of antibiotics of azithromycin to only children does select for resistance in those children. I know that there are studies ongoing that will look at whether there's any sort of effect on sort of a spillover effect on resistance in children or in people who are not in the age range of 1 to 59 months for distribution for child mortality. So I think that that would be an interesting sort of next step would be to understand whether selecting for resistance in the children also confers resistance in people who are not treated as part of the MDA. So I think the hope is that by treating a subset of the population, you select for less resistance in the community, but we don't know that for sure.
Thank you. We are a little bit delayed. I suggest we change from bacteria to the parasites now. And so we enter with protozoans, leishmaniasis. Professor Sundar, we need your experience, please.
Thank you, Professor Santiago. I'll share the screen.
Es muy bueno este tío. Jorge Alvar siempre me lo ha dicho.
Can you see my screen?
Go to slideshow.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we are
Put it in slideshow.
It is in slideshow?
No.
No? Now?
No.
Is it moving?
No.
Please share again, Professor Sundar.
Try again.
Yeah. Now. Okay.
Right.
It stops moving in my, okay. Thank you. So, as you know, visceral leishmaniasis has three big foci of the disease. One is in Brazil, other one is in Africa, where Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya are affected. And the third and so far the biggest focus of visceral leishmaniasis has been Southeast Asia, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Here you can see that this is the area of Indian subcontinent where the disease is very, and in Bihar, actually Bihar is the state where most of the cases have been reported. Of course, there are reports from Nepal as well as from Bangladesh and other parts of the country of India. Now, treatment of visceral leishmaniasis was pentavalent antimonials were the only drug used for this treatment. In the Indian subcontinent, the earlier days, the dose used was 10 milligram per kilo for 6 to 10 days. However, the dose and duration was subsequently increased when a decline in efficacy was observed. And some workers said that not every patient is responding. So in 1980, Dr. Sengupta, he increased the number of injections from 6 to 10 days to 20 days and found a cure rate of 96%. Then 4 years later, Thakur et al., they saw that 20 days of 600 milligram of antimonials are curing 87%. Then he further increased the dose and reported in 1988 that 20 days of 20 milligram per kilo cures 81% and 40 days cure 97%. That means that we have almost increased the doses 10 times from what was earlier used. So what we did a study where we combined pentavalent antimonials and gamma interferon, and where you can see that we randomized into three groups. One was antimony alone, second was antimony with interferon gamma for 30 days, and antimony interferon gamma for 15 days. There was actually, if you look at this results, cardiotoxicity occurred in a significant number of patients, and there were 4 deaths in this, about 4% in antimony alone and 4% in antimony plus hyphen gamma for 30 days. Initial cure was seen in only 38% patients with antimony alone, 48% with interferon gamma for 30 days and antimony, and 42% in antimony with interferon gamma for 15 days. And there few patients relapsed. The final cure rate was 36% only with antimony alone for 30 days. And it didn't increase much even after addition of interferon gamma. And it was 49%, which is far from satisfactory. And in 15 days course of interferon gamma resulted in a cure rate of 42%. So it was far from satisfactory. The results were not very good. Then we did another study where we wanted to test what is happening in a larger number of patients. So we gave antimonials, pentavalent antimonials for 30 days at the rate of 20 milligram per kilo, and we treated 209 patients. You can see that 184 patients though completed therapy, but treatment failure was in 95 patients. So more than 50% patients have failed. Initial cure was seen in 89%. Initial cure we call when immediately after the treatment, if you do parasitological examination, you can look at the parasites. And final cure is at 6 months of after the end of treatment. If there are no signs of disease, parasitological or clinical, then we call it final cure. Relapses occurred in 14 patients and 2 were lost to follow-up. So finally, we got a final cure rate of only 35%. So it was very, very dismal. And as you can see here in this, I have put in various studies that have been done for efficacy of antimony. And you can see that the efficacy has gone down over the years. And in 1991, Jha reported 64%. Then 1995, we reported 60% cure rate. And then, of course, these 2 studies, 36%, 35% by that I have just told you. And then Thakur also reported in 2004, 46%. So you see this picture, and where you can see that there are scar marks over abdomen. And what has happened, these pictures were not uncommon in those days. These patients were treated with antimonials, did not respond. Then the guardians went to the faith healers, where they tried to burn the spleen of these patients. And here they tried to burn the liver in this small girl. And this girl was in a very bad shape when she came here. And of course, these patients, these children also. So this was the status of affairs at that time. And because we had no alternative, we have antimonials, and then we had another drug called pentamidine, which I'll discuss later. So what were the factors responsible for, is there any misuse of drugs or anything? So what we did that we surveyed 312 patients, and what we saw that in the first contact, 73% patients went to local healers. So they are not qualified medical practitioners, and only 27% went to the qualified medical practitioner. As far as regularity of treatment is concerned, about 58% took only regular treatment and 42% irregular treatment. Duration of treatment was again incomplete in almost 50% of the patients. So finally, only 26% patients had adequate dose and duration of treatment. And this is considered to be an important role in development of drug resistance to antimonials in VL. Pentamidine was the second drug which was used for a short period. You can see that in 1983 and 1984, the cure rate with 10 to 15 injections of pentamidine at 4 milligram per kilo was 99 and 93%, very good. Unfortunately, again, if you look at about 10 years later, the cure rate has gone down to 75%, even after more than 20 injections. And here Dr. Thakur reported the 78% cure rate with 10 to 33 injections. And we reported about 69% with 15 to 20 injections in 1997. Then there was no option. So in 1999, the government of India called an expert committee meeting where it was decided that those areas where more than 10% drug resistance is occurring, amphotericin B deoxycholate will be used. It was easier said than done because use was restricted only to the hospitals. Patient has to be hospitalized for 5 to 6 weeks. Very high incidence of drug-related adverse events. Clinical and laboratory monitoring was required because of these adverse events. And if you look at the drug cost and the cost to the patient, wages lost, and the family, it was very, very expensive. And so this could not be deployed in peripheral health facilities and was actually not used extensively during that time. Then came miltefosine. miltefosine has big oral advantage. So this was actually in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. We have a elimination program called as Kalajara elimination program, which was launched in 2005, and where it was aimed to eliminate VL as a public health problem to less incidence of less than 1 per 10,000 by 2015. Unfortunately, this could not be met, and now the next target is 2023. So in this elimination program, since miltefosine was oral, so this miltefosine was adopted. Unfortunately, the duration of treatment was again very long, 28 days treatment, so non-compliance was very common. Teratogenicity, it was a teratogenic drug, so contraception needed for several months. Why several months? Because this drug has a long half-life of 1 week or more. And then about 2% had severe adverse events, so we needed laboratory monitoring. And then because of the long half-life, there was a fear of emergence of resistance. In a recent evaluation, we found that relapse rate doubled from 3% to 6% after a decade of use. In Nepal, where it was used for the first time, relapse rate was 20%. And this was a very, and similar results were reported from Bangladesh, where about 80% patients only were cured by miltefosine. So this drug was again not used, and it has changed to the single dose amphotericin B since 2014. So what is the way forward? We need certainly we need new oral anti-leishmanial drugs, preferably oral. We want a short duration of regimens, not a regimen, not a duration of 28 days or more. And then these drugs should be given as a directly observed therapy. Unfortunately, in India, the drugs are available over the counter freely. So that should not occur if we want to really prevent resistance. And then combination, which was recommended in a study, after we did a study where we combined liposomal amphotericin with miltefosine for 7 days, and the cure rate was 98.7%, very high. And this was the highest that I have ever seen in a clinical trial in leishmaniasis. And then liposomal amphotericin B with perimomycin for 10 days. Again, cure rate was very high. And then miltefosine with perimomycin for 10 days. Again, cure rate was very high. The advantage of miltefosine with perimomycin is that you don't have to use refrigerators, because liposomal amphotericin B has to be kept in below 25 degrees temperature. So in the end, I would say that what we have very little. We are only dependent upon only one drug at the moment, that too on donation. We do not know if that drug, something happens to the donation or something happens to the drug, it stops acting. How we are going to manage these patients. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this nice overview of the problematics in leishmaniasis, Professor Sundar. Do we have questions?
Yes, Chair, we do have questions for Professor Sundar. I'm just going to So for Professor Sundar, one of the questions is, what is best practice advice to national leishmaniasis control programs in preventing antimicrobial resistance in VL treatment?
As I said, at the moment, the control program is dependent upon only one drug, and that drug is not affordable. In fact, because of donation, we are able to use this drug. So we need to as I said in my presentation, that we need to have combination of available drugs, and it has been recommended, but unfortunately could not be implemented because of the non-availability of the drugs and other factors. So prevention of drug resistance is through use of correct and most effective regimen. Multidrug therapy appears to be the way to prevent development of resistance. And as I want to reiterate that free availability of anti-leishmanial drugs across the counter should be restricted very strictly so that the drug is not available for misuse.
Another question that has come through, Professor, is what actions would you recommend to stakeholders, particularly academia and researchers working in the area of AMR, to monitor antimicrobial resistance in VL treatment?
Well, I think earliest detection can be occurred if we carefully look at the cure rate of different regimens, and a decline in cure rate could be the first signal of development of drug resistance, as we saw in case of antimonials. In late 70s, it was reported by in uncontrolled studies that 30% of the patients are not responding to antimonials. So monitoring of the cure rate by the prevailing regimen should be done. And then, as I said, we definitely need new drugs, and preferably if we can give oral combination, that will be the best. Thank you.
I see that there are many questions from Professor Sundar. It's impossible to answer all. So people putting questions, they have to know that there will be an effort to answer them after the meeting. So we have to go on with, because time is very limited. Thank you very much, Professor Sundar, for the nice presentation. So now we go to an interesting overview of Dr. Lebeke about how to monitor the problem of drug resistance. Bruno, please, your turn.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I've been asked to give an overview on monitoring of drug efficacy in preventive chemotherapy medicines, but that's of course a very broad topic. So as you can see from my background, I'm more into intestinal worms, STH, and that's what I'm gonna talk about in this meeting. Just a brief background. So up to date, MDA, so mass drug administration at the school level, is currently the cornerstone to control the morbidity of these diseases. And depending on the prevalence, populations are treated twice a year, once a year, or not recommended if the prevalence is at baseline is too low, in case 20%. We do have two drugs, albendazole and mebendazole, and these are kindly provided to the original manufacturers. As you can see in this graph represents the number of children treated and the coverage of coverage over time, going from 2008 and 2018. You can see there has been a huge effort in distributing the drugs and administering the drugs to the children that are in need of these treatments. In essence, in 1 decade, the coverage has multiplied by 4. So there's a huge drug pressure on the worms. So why do we monitor? Why we do have to monitor drug? So the coin has two sides. Obviously, it's great that thanks to these drugs, we are combating the morbidity caused by these worms. The other side, though, is that we might be selecting for anthelmintic resistance. And is this a real threat? Well, it is. Because despite the fact that we have two different drugs, they are belonging to the same pharmaceutical family, and hence they have the same mode of action to kill the worms. Bottom line, we have one drug. On top of that, we are giving them in a single oral dose, which is not not always 100% efficacious. And on top of that, we are underdosing at a large scale. And finally, we only have few alternative drugs. So if antimicrobial resistance would emerge at one time, we don't really have an alternative drug or drug combinations to implement. How to monitor drug efficacy. So as Daniel has indicated in this opening talk, there has been efforts to set up a surveillance system to monitor at the global scale the drug efficacy and the emergence of antibiotic resistance. And with the support of WHO and the financial support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have been able to not only draft a study protocol with a lot of details, which is available online, but also really to implement, to pilot this survey. In the following slides, I will just go quite quickly how this monitoring system looks like. It consists of 3 consecutive steps. So first step is that we select the country. And for this, we go to the PCT WHO database, and we are looking at those countries which has been successful in achieving a median national coverage at school-age children of at least 50%. On top of that, we explore whether those countries have subnational coverage data. The reason for that is that we want to select one implementation unit at the subnational level, of course, which has a very high coverage, in this case, at least 90%. So you can see from the selection criteria that we're really looking for problem. We're looking at countries, and within a country in areas where the coverage has been very high for a long period of time. Of course, we also consider other aspects such as the prevalence, presence of sentinel schools, and accessibility of schools and laboratory facilities. The third step involves the field study. And this is illustrated in this slide, where at day 0, we collect a stool sample and we determine the number of eggs excreted in the different stool samples using a standard microscopic method, in this case, the duplicate kilocats. Subsequently, either albendazole or mebendazole is provided, depending on the program, which drug the program is using. And after 2 to 3 weeks, we reassess the numbers of eggs excreted, and we are determining the reduction in egg counts, which reflects the efficacy of the drug. At the bottom of this graph, you also see that we are preserving stool samples for further molecular analysis. And the simple reason for this is because at this point in time, we don't really have validated markers of antibiotic resistance. So here, future research is required. So these are the different countries. If you apply all these different criteria, and you can see a lot of countries, these countries have been able to achieve a high coverage for a long time of periods. And just to give you an update on where we stand, the countries indicated in green have already completed their exercise for which we do have efficacy results. Those indicated in orange are still pending. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, we were not able to complete the trial. And then in purple, violet, these are the countries that we're planning to do in 2020. So you can see that for a majority of the countries that are really successful in achieving high coverage, will soon be able to report their efficacy results. What were the results so far? And this is represented in this graph, where for the 2 drugs, albendazole and mebendazole, across the different countries where we assessed the efficacy, you can see for each of the drugs across the countries and for each SDH species, you can see whether the drug was satisfactory, doubtful, or reduced. And the classification of the drug efficacy was based on WHO guidelines. Very brief, for both Ascaris and Trachomatis and both drugs, the drugs are very satisfactory. But for mebendazole, we observed reduced or doubtful efficacy. At this point in time, we are still exploring other means or other potential factors that would explain this reduced efficacy, of course, before we can claim any true treatment failure. So to conclude, some take-home messages. emergence of anthelmintic resistance in STH is very much likely, given the high coverage and the prospects of continued drug donations by the pharmaceutical companies. Surveillance system is piloted and being implemented, and is also now incorporated in one of the goals for future as part, I would say, of the M&E of the programs. We need to exclude, and this is very important, treatment failure does not always imply anthelmintic resistance. So we always need to explore other potential factors, for instance, poor quality of drugs. As I mentioned, still a lot of research is required to confirm or to validate markers that are linked to anthelmintic resistance. And as research is going, we are also going to update the WHO guidelines of 2013 to monitoring the efficacy of STH and schisto. Schisto is also included in this part. So what rests is just to acknowledge all of the different partners that have been involved in these trials or in this work in general. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very pleased or very happy to take any questions if there would be any questions. Thanks a lot.
Professor, you're muted.
We have questions?
Yes, we do, Professor, if you may allow. One question is about the WHO manual for assessing anthelmintic efficacy of albendazole, mebendazole, and praziquantel was developed 10 years ago by WHO, somewhere around 2012. What have we learned over the past years? Is it time to do a new efficacy assessment after all these years?
Like I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, really we need to revise some of these aspects that have been put forward in the WHO guidelines. For instance, additional support of which diagnostic method to use. Also interpreting and reporting the data. At this point in time, we are only reporting the point estimate, so just the point estimate without reporting the variation that we observe across the data. So these are all small changes, but it's time to revise and update the documents.
Time for another question.
I don't see any other question directed at Dr. Levesque, Chair.
Okay, so thanks very much, Bruno. And we go to the last one, which is my turn. ¿Dónde está aquí? ¿Dónde está? ¿Cuál es la mía? Okay. Okay, so we go to the plathelmines, to the trematodes. And just for those who are not familiar with this disease, we have two causal agents, hepatica and gigantica. Hepatica of worldwide distribution, gigantica only restricted to given parts of Africa and Asia. Both are liver flukes who developed in biliary canals and also gallbladder. They follow a two-host life cycle in freshwater transmission. So we have on one side a definitive host with very low specificity of the flukes. So they develop mainly in herbivorous mammals, livestock, but also sylvatic animals. And unfortunately also humans. And on the other side, we have an intermediate host or vector, which is a snail, an amphibious snail, and belonging to the family of the limnates with a marked specificity. Galba fossaria species transmit hepatica, whereas radix species transmit gigantica. And another important aspect is how people and animals become infected. This is by ingesting the metacercariae together, whether with freshwater vegetables or drinking of contaminated natural water. At the moment, we have one drug of choice, which is triclavendazole. This drug is very effective against both migrating juveniles and total flocks. Easy to administrate orally, and it shows an excellent tolerability. Very, very recently, we have even been able to demonstrate that it is useful to treat early postnatally infected children. It is very efficient for in-hospitalized patients. 2 doses of 10 milligram kilos show very high cure rates, and very, very rarely only we need to go for a 3rd dose. And in preventive chemotherapy in hyperendemic areas, we are now using 10 milligram kilo once per year, with the main purpose of reducing morbidity, which in all trematodes is strictly linked to the burden, the number of flukes in the liver. No? We have alternative drugs, but they are not sufficiently effective. Braziquantel, we do not know why, but it is not effective against these liver flukes. Butanol was the drug of choice before triclavendazole, so there is still there if you need. Nitazoxanide has proved to be useful in areas where the burdens are very low, and albendazole shows only 70% efficacy, with a problem of cross resistance with triclavendazole. So WHO reached a donation agreement with Novartis years ago for triclavendazole, and this allowed us to launch a worldwide strategy against this disease. We started in 4 countries, and the results were very successful in showing that there was no problems in side effects. So in 2007, the program was launched, and slowly, progressively, the different countries have entered in this initiative. Now, the problem of resistance to triclavendazole, you see here at top left the different animal endemic areas where it has been already reported, and at top right you see the reports of resistance detected in humans in human endemic areas. So just to emphasize that the reports usually concern very, very few resistant patients. No? So aspects to be considered on triclavendazole is we still do not know the mode of action. We have no biomarkers, as I have seen in many of the other diseases, as you have commented before. And the data we have suggests today that triclavendazole resistance originates in animals. No? And up to the moment, all patients in which resistance has been reported concern infections in animal areas where resistance has already been reported in these animals. Very important is that we do not still why, but there is no data suggesting that there is a geographical spread, but who knows, no? But so all indicates that the resistance to triclavendazole appear independently in each endemic area. No, this is related to uncontrolled production of generics locally here and there, and subsequent selling of these generics. No? So the proposal is, because we have seen in the northern Bolivian altiplano and pandemic area where we are already 10 years implementing preventive chemotherapy, is that people became, and mainly children, became reinfected, as we have seen in the interannual monitorings. No? And the background of these reinfections is evidently the high infection rates in livestock. So the idea is to implement a complementary, so to go on with the preventive chemotherapy intervention, but complementarily implement one health action to reduce the human infection risk. And the last main purpose would be to develop a protocol of guidelines that we could extrapolate to other areas where we have to take into account, and in the Altiplano there is only one Fastiola species and only one limnate vector species, which simplify all these tasks. No? So the problem of this disease, as we have seen, is that there are many interacting factors. We have on one side the humans, the domestic and the sylvatic reservoirs, the limnate snail vectors, the environment, and the climate, because this is a disease highly influenced by climate. And so in the different compartments, we have to work both experimentally and in the field, no? To characterize, for instance, the different limnate vector species that are present, and all the different factors which influence this, mainly the seasonality and the transmission capacity of these snails. And here we show how unexpectedly we have recently proved that there is an impact of climate change, namely by a global phenomenon, phenomenon of global warming. And this has allowed the snails to spread, to widen their geographical distribution. And this means that at present, geographical endemic area is spreading due to this impact. No? The other compartment, which is important, of course, is livestock. And this is why we have focusing in One Health. No? And here also field studies and experimental studies. There are many different aspects that people usually do not consider, such as the movements of the different livestock species inside and outside the endemic area. And here, for instance, the donkey was an unexpected problem that we have recently emphasized. And there are, in these remote rural areas, there is not so much money to implement measures. So we have to push in the sense that they implement easily feasible measures, such as construction of troughs, the construction of fences around the freshwater collections innovated by the snails. No? But we have also to analyze, to quantify the participation of each reservoir species and breeds. Usually people only think at sheep and cattle, but in sheep and cattle we have different breeds, and these breeds show completely different susceptibilities and resistance. And this means that we have to previously analyze all that in the way to establish species control priorities, because in one of these endemic areas you may have many different domestic animals participating in the transmission, and there will be no money for to treat or to monitor all the animals. So we have to select according to priorities which animal is more responsible for the transmission than others. No? There is the human compartment, which concerns not only the participation of humans in the transmission, but also their social tradition and behavioral aspects, and other factors such as outdoor defecation practices, improvement of toilets and latrines, and so on. So all this means field studies to assess the prevalences and burdens, intensities of infection. The burden here very important to estimate the morbidity of these diseases. And after the campaigns to monitor, but here changing the test to be used, so tests with high sensitivity to detect the infections in low burdens, and also very important in the different phases of the disease. No? So the experimental studies in the lab to assess up to which level human participates in the liver fluke transmission. And this is very important to assess whether preventive chemotherapy may at long term induce the appearance of resistance at human level too. No? So at the end, is One Health action for the control for fastiola feasible? Yes, but there are many, many difficulties. Here, as I said before, in the Altiplano, we are only dealing with one fastiola and one vector species, but when we enter in other areas in Latin America or even in Africa and Asia, immediately you have more than one lineage species playing the role of vector, which means different overlapping seasonalities, different ecologies, and different vectors which show more or less anthropophily or more relations to livestock than to humans, and all this is important. And in parts of Africa and Asia, moreover, the coexistence of Hepatica gigantica and hybrid forms appearing because, well, these trematodes are able to crossbreed additionally to the selfing usual fecundation they follow. No, so the conclusion is it is feasible, but we will need combination of field and experimental studies. We will need long multidisciplinary studies and long-term funding. And we have to consider that an appropriate monitoring of the results of One Health actions are usually not affordable in large human endemic areas. So how to face this? Go for a previous pilot One Health action in a small selected zone, where the activities may be affordable and controllable, and where the evaluation of the efficiency of the control measures can be made. Of course, this will mean that to demonstrate that these pilots only are selected as representative of the endemic area, and that at the end you may extrapolate, extend the measure, the successful measures you saw to the rest of the endemic area. So conclusion, feasible, yes, but not easy at all. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have questions.
Yes, there is one on the screen, Professor Mascoma. So it reads, in addition of what is WHO doing, what do you think should be the efforts made by FAO and OIE?
Very nice question. One thing that we should go for is how we can use the efforts already made by FAO and OIE in the treatment of other diseases of livestock. So to take advantage of already these efforts to also fight against fascioliasis at the same time in the way to reduce money needed and so on and so on. And things that are already implemented in these remote rural areas, all these are very welcome, of course. More questions?
And not directly to you, Professor. I don't see any more question directed to your presentation.
We are a little bit delayed, so we can open the final discussion and comments for overall. For this, we have around 5 minutes only before the final words of the Chief Masilela. So are there comments, general comments or questions?
There are a couple of general questions that I would like to address. And then if we have time, there are several questions for Professor Shyam Sundar, and as well as also Professor Kambo. So let me answer the couple of general questions, and then if depending on time, we may direct questions to the other two professors.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so there was a question, what type of recommendations you may provide for the use of ivermectin, widely used recently for COVID, but originally used for antiparasitic drug? So the general response we have for this is there is no evidence that ivermectin is effective for the treatment of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection. So WHO does not recommend the use of ivermectin, which is donated for NTD mass treatment, for any other use other than recommended in the national programs. So we recommend that national programs and drug regulatory authorities need to undertake strict monitoring on the use and distribution of ivermectin. So for the time being, we don't encourage the use of ivermectin for COVID or any other other than indicated for the NTDs. And then there is another question about how we define the anti-resistance, antipyretic resistance in this webinar and what is the cutoff, etc. So generally, we define antiparasitic resistance as the genetical ability of parasites to survive treatment with antiparasitic drug treatment that was generally effective against those parasites in the past. So the same applies for antibiotic resistance or antiviral or antifungal resistance. And there is one last general question is about young people having been very active in the antimicrobial resistance space. What recommendation do panelists have to young people to ensure they fight against antimicrobial resistance in NTDs as a way of securing a generation that is free from NTDs? So from my part, I recommend that young people, they are actively joining the movement of fighting the neglected tropical diseases. And in the antimicrobial resistance movement, they can also participate in creating awareness using their networks, including the social media and also other innovative communication methods. So that is all with regard to the general questions. If there are any time, we can move to other specific questions on leprosy and leishmaniasis. Otherwise, if there are other general questions, Ashok can bring them in.
I have a question for Professor Sundar about leishmaniasis. Well, you have talking about visceral leishmaniasis, but how about drug resistance in the other leishmania species, which are more zoonotic? Latin America and so on and so. There is a relationship between the appearance of resistance to the drugs you are using to the more or less zoonotic characteristics of the transmission of these other leishmania species?
Actually, transmission in anthroponotic foci makes the drug more prone to antimicrobial resistance. Whereas in genotypic, they are passing through the animals and then to the human. And so there is no systematic resistance reported from the genotypic foci.
Yeah. Yeah. So treatment, say for instance, in dogs has no impact on drug resistance in humans. Nothing seen on this.
Say that again, please.
In this treatment, people treating dogs, which are reservoirs of many leishmania species as infantum and so on. There is no impact of these treatments on animals afterwards to the resistance at human level, no?
I mean, it is yet to be studied, but I think, I suspect that it will be. There will be an...
Se corta.
So about the questions on leprosy, I answered by Slido. I don't know if if the answer is going only to the presenter or to all people, but so if possible, I can answer by Slido because I don't think we have much time. But I would like to add something about the young involved in AMR and NTD. One important thing is that you need to have a memory of what happened. Because often, as Professor Levesque has shown, usually when you are giving antimicrobials, the first effect is efficacy, so you're quite happy. But if you not forget, if you not wait for some years to the resistance emerge, then you will say there are no resistance. But you need to wait, and also when you observe resistance, you need to look back what was done several years before. And so I think that was very well shown from many of the presentation. And I think that's something very important. You need to work with old people sometimes.
Yes. I agree.
Professor Mascoma, probably we may need to...
Yes, we give the voice to the chief. Dr. Maselela is there to give the final talk and to close the meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Mascoma. And thank you, colleagues, for joining today. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Professor Santiago Mascoma, thank you for being an excellent chair. Thank you very much for, and our colleagues for moderating, our colleagues in the department for helping to moderate the very rich discussion. Thank you to all the panelists who have taken their time to be on the panel today, and I really appreciate. So this webinar comes at a time when there was recently last week a launch of the AMR Global Leaders Group, chaired by the Prime Ministers of Barbados, Prime Minister Her Excellency Mia Mottley, and Her Excellency Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister of Bangladesh, raising the level of engagement on AMRs to a very, very high level. And so I think we come at a time when there's really a lot of interest in AMRs, both from the technical, but from the political and advocacy side. My opinion is that this World Antibiotic Resistance Awareness Week fits very well in the context of NTDs, as we deal with a large range of pathogens that include viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi. And really, I guess no other department handles the variety of antimicrobials in treating those infections than our department does. So we feel very privileged to be a part of this discussion. And we really appreciate the discussion that has gone forward. As at NTDs, we have been reaching more than 1 billion people with treatments for the 5th successive year. And these include mass treatments and also individual treatments which have exceeded expectations. And although we have been able to reduce morbidity and mortality, this has constantly reminded us continued vigilance to generate awareness about best practices. And we've shared some of the best practices with not only policymakers, health workers, but also the general public to minimize and avoid emergence and the spread of drug resistance infections. The topic is vast and requires a series of deliberation, but today, as a start, we have listened to some of the basic principles, the best practices, the One Health approach, and key messages for some selected NTDs. The scope of One Health approach calls for closer collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, and the World Organization of Animal Health, as the threat of antimicrobial resistance emerges from multiple factors of the overuse of antimicrobials. In the spirit of the new roadmap to work across departments internally and cross-sectorally, the NTD department, which is now the anchor department for zoonosis, will continue to work together with the AMR GCP department, which is still which is coordinating the work of WHO's tripartite agenda with FAO and OIE in collaboration with other relevant departments. So finally, we also welcome the decision to broaden the scope of the AMR movement beyond antibiotics. And this is to include antifungals, and that's very exciting to us as we also work on a whole range of fungal diseases. The slogan, we appreciate the slogan for 2020, antimicrobials handled with care. And we really, appreciate this opportunity to partner with our colleagues working on AMR to have this webinar. And as I said, this is it's very important to us because we deal with the diseases which can easily be prevented, controlled, eliminated, or even eradicated. So for example, yours will be the only disease where eradication is possible with the use of antibiotics alone. And it is therefore important that we preserve our therapeutic arsenals. And so it's really important for us to focus on antimicrobial resistance. At the same time, some of the diseases rely entirely on one or two medicines. And that's why we say handle with care. We mean effective communication, education, training, best practices for do's and don'ts, intersectoral collaborative efforts, exchange of information, and constant watch on the use of or overuse of medicine. So from today's meeting, it's apparent that NTDs need to strengthen or establish drug efficacy and resistance monitoring and surveillance, including laboratory networks. We once again appreciate all of you who have been instrumental in making this webinar possible. I'd like to really give my thanks and commendation to my brother Haile, who who's the director for AMR, and his colleagues for being great partners in this work together. Thank you very much once again to the panelists, and once again, Chair, muchas gracias.
Thank you. So Daniel, we can close now.
Yes.
And say thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Professor Mascoma and all colleagues. The webinar is adjourned.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. ¿Dónde se da?
Abajo tú, abajo derecha.
Thank you to everyone.